Hey, so welcome first off to this video. It's been a while since I've posted anything on any social media, and there is something that's so very important to me, and that is mental health. And right now it's May 2026, and it's Mental Health Month. And so I'm Anthony. I've been a men's life coach for close to 9 years now. And this subject, mental health, is so very important to me. And I want to share something with you today that there's growth. There's time for growth. There's time for looking at things differently. And this is also the month that 3 years ago my father passed away. Now I have to share with you that my father, I grew up extremely afraid of my father. I didn't grow up afraid of the dark, afraid of strangers. I grew up afraid of the very person who was supposed to love me and protect me. Now, if you know anything about brain development, you know that the first 7 years of a child's life are the most important years for brain development because the brain is learning, taking in everything about its environment. And it's all about survival. And when children are raised in an environment where there's verbal abuse, physical abuse, the brain is being developed in a way to learn how to handle and survive those situations. And as you can imagine, if you have experienced this, you know perhaps how deep this can impact your life in every area, not just one. Perhaps people often think relationships, but every area of your life, it will impact. And for many years, I was always questioning what would have been like if I had not had an alcoholic father who was verbally abusive, physically abusive, very critical. How would I have been? What could I have accomplished? What could I have done? And consistently trying to work on myself and better myself. And as I mentioned, this is the month, almost 3 years ago this month, my father passed away. In the last year of my father's life, we didn't talk. And I'll share with you the last conversation we had. I'd gone to my father about something that was really important to me. And during that conversation, my father asked, I want to know the truth. And when my father would start a conversation like that, I knew he didn't want to know the truth. He wanted to know his truth. He wanted to know, he wanted to hear what he wanted to hear. Because all these years, we'd had conversations about him physically abusing my brother and I, and how in his mind, he just could not imagine or even think that he would have done that to his own children, what I had shared with him. So when he started this conversation, I knew, or this starting trying to start this conversation with that sentence, I knew it was not going to be good. And you have to understand that my father and I had this really tumultuous relationship up and down throughout um, my life, basically, especially as an adult. And my father begins to basically make his case that it would have been almost impossible for him to have done the things that he did because there were other things that could have happened. Now, you have to remember this was the late 70s, early 80s, and spanking and this sort of thing was common, right? And my father being an alcoholic, I mean, even I could go into that subject of people drinking and driving and getting away with it and this sort of thing. But my father had this idea that in his or had these ideas in his head that if my mom really wanted to do something, she would have done it. And as this conversation progressed, I had had enough in my life and felt that my father was just never going to give me, right? I want to make this point because I was focusing on myself, give me what I wanted him to hear. Now, I went to him for something different. He brought up this conversation, but it ended up being something that ended up being the last conversation we had. And I remember just having enough. I had a glass of water. I got up, I put it in the sink, and I told my father that I was leaving and that this was it. This is this was it. I was never gonna see him or ever talk to him ever again. And it's interesting because I think sometimes people say those sorts of things. This is the last time we're ever going to talk. This is the last time we're ever going to see, especially among father and son. And it's not the truth, right? You say these things out of anger, but I meant it. And my father approached me, and I stuck out my hand, and I looked him in the eye as we're shaking hands, and I said, "Dad, I wish you nothing but the best for the rest of your life." And he said, "Son, I wish you the same." Kind of gave my okay, shook his hand, opened the door, and out I went. And something very interesting happened. As I was walking down, leaving down this path, my father opens the door. And the last words that my father ever said to me was, "Do you want some water?" Now, where I grew up and where my father lived, or where I was at the time, so this was basically my how it always had been, this 2.5 hour distance from each other. And so that's where the reference why he would have asked me if I wanted some water. But it was just very interesting in my father's mind, not realizing that I was serious. He still asked me if I wanted water. Now, I didn't know, and he certainly didn't know, that almost a year to the date, he passed away from lung cancer. He was a Vietnam veteran, and his ship was exposed. He was in the Navy, and his ship was exposed to Agent Orange. He smoked for 30 something years, I think, of his life, um, somewhere around there. And, he died from lung cancer. And just recently, right, because when you grow up with an abusive father, an alcoholic father, you suffer from a lot of different things. There's a lot of suffering, there's a lot of trauma. And all those years, I was focused on myself, recovering, developing, growing. And it's partly why today perhaps I'm a men's life coach. Because I saw how my father suffered in his life, his failed marriages, the lack of a relationship with his kids, and just how I don't know if he was ever truly happy. But one day I began to shift and I began to think differently. And one day I began to think about my parents, not only my father, but my parents. And I began to think about what was my, what for years, I believe, I was asking myself this question: why was my father so mad? What was he so mad about? Because I haven't gone into the physical abuse or shared the physical abuse that I suffered from, but my father would be so mad that he would have saliva just, as he was talking, just not spitting, but just so much anger would be coming out of his mouth, and he would have this saliva, just drops of saliva just on his lips of just from yelling. And one day here not too long ago, I began to think about what was his childhood like? What did he go through? And I began to look further into this. And when I knew his story, I knew his history, but not how it impacted his life. Because what we experience as children, especially from 0 to 7, of course, even after that, of course, even as adults, we go through traumatic experiences. But when it comes to brain development and how we see the world, how we develop to see the world, especially around those who are supposed to love us and protect us. And my father, he lost his mother at a very young age. I believe it was between around 6, 7 years old. And it was this that impacted his life. That my father never recovered. And only those who have lost a parent at a young age would truly understand what one goes through, especially, I think, no matter which parent, but the mom, right? That mom of just being there, loving. You often, as a child, you spend more time with your mother, and he never recovered from that, or he never recovered, never. And I use the word recover as though it's something that just goes away, but that it's not the right word, but it's something that to come to understanding and to accept is what I mean by recover. And I can see how this impacted his whole life. Because when a child doesn't receive the love and affection and care from their parents, and in my case, and in my father's case, his mother, right? We want that love. We crave that love. We crave that affection, that loyalty, that care, that love. My father, his story is after his mother passed away, he was sent to live with some cousins because his father couldn't take care of him and his other siblings. Eventually, they reunited, but even that experience of losing a mother, going and living with another family, and this was actually a big family, and he was just one of, he was just, of many children that this family had. So those development years for him and how it impacted his life. And then shortly after high school, he went to Vietnam. He enlisted in the Navy and went to Vietnam. And shortly after he came back from that, met my mom. And then they had my brother and their first son, my brother. And my mom shares with me that my father was jealous because now all the love and affection and attention, well, I shouldn't say all the love, but the love and affection of attention for a newborn child was going to my brother, their firstborn. And now, if you see where I'm going, that my father suffered. My father was still suffering and still wanting that love and affection and attention from that he didn't get from his mother. He was wanting to get it from his wife. And now there was somebody else that was taking away that what he craved and what he wanted. And it continued. 3 years later, I was born, and he just, now it was even less attention and affection. And how all of this anger, and I feel my father, I feel that in some ways there was some lack of respect. Like he didn't get respect from others for whatever reason. I truly feel this in some way, because I feel that he wasn't getting the love and affection and attention from his wife. And when my and growing up as children, right, we're gonna be rebellious. We're gonna test the boundaries. We're you're kids, right? We're kids. We're doing things wrong, and we're learning, we're growing. And but for him, it was a form of disrespect. And for somebody who perhaps doesn't have any respect for himself and doesn't understand, right? There's no manual for parents to raise children. And so for him, he was only using what he had, which wasn't sufficient. But the way this anger, all of it was just onto us. My mother being physically and verbally abusive, my brother and I being verbally and physically abusive. And for him, the times where he spanked me, it was just, I still remember it, just him, just with all of his might, everything he had. And I remember one time when my brother and I, we were both being spanked, we're crying, and I remember we were in our underwear, and I remember I had to go to the bathroom. And and I know I remember I was just jumping up and down, and I verbally expressed that I needed to go to the bathroom, and my father let me go. And I just remember just wishing I would just be peeing forever. I never wanted to go back out there and face my father, because I knew what was going to happen. Now imagine the growth, the brain development living in that environment. And then knowing afterwards I had to go back out into the lion's den, and I knew what was going to happen. And so understanding how that would have affected me or anyone in that type of environment. But to know that my father had no idea what he was doing in the sense of, of, of our development and how it would impact our lives, my life, for a very long time. But what helped me? Of course, I've done my own growth. Of course, I went through my own therapy. Of course, I've done and gone through a lot of different things. But what I started really looking at is what my father went through as a child, and how a child who goes through such an experience that he went through, and how these things get passed on from generation to generation because of something that they experienced with their own parents, and their own parents had their childhoods as well, and how those things get passed on. I don't have any children, and I'm so grateful that I never had children, because I'm certain I would have done something to continue this anger, this this trauma. I would have continued it. And so what I began to realize, or to have compassion for my father. One time my father shared a story with me about, because he shared a birthday near his sister, and how his mom would bake a cake, just one. And I mentioned one time, well, maybe they couldn't afford to make two cakes. And he was like, no, no, if she really wanted to. Now, right, my father's already in his 60s, and sharing the same story of hurt and pain about his mother. And and knowing that this one time, coming to understand how important his birthday was. Because one time I asked him, it wasn't too long after the last time I had seen him. I asked him, we got in this conversation, and there was something about some birthday. And eventually it was mentioned about his birthday. And I mentioned something about his birthday. And then I made the comment about, do you know the birthdays of your own children? And he starts going off, and but there was something so very intimate, something he held tight about his birthday, and just how these little things that I began to really understand about my father, that they were seeds, they weren't things that I just automatically understood. And so this, going back to now, recently, within the last, I would say, 5 6 months of beginning to heal even more, in the sense that where today I'm so grateful for my father, and so grateful that, because I am him, and who I am. Of course, I've grown and developed and had different experiences and different education and exposure to different information, but I still am him, and I give who I've become credit to him. And perhaps he would have done something different had he been given the opportunity to be educated in a certain way, be exposed to different things. And so I look at my struggles and the things that I've had to overcome because of the abuse. But I know today, because I began to have more compassion and empathy and understanding towards my father, because of what he went through and suffered as a child. And it's not a pass, it's just more understanding to be, our parents were children at one time too. And here recently, I have a new, I have a client who's going through an issue with his mother. Now this is with his mother, but it's still with the parent. And and how I wish I was 31, learning about, understanding what our parents, what my parents experienced, and asking him, similar questions to get him to think about considering the impact that their child had on their life, and how the things that they're going through as a result of their parents' childhood, right? So I want to share this with you. I know some of this, I'll be sharing more in upcoming videos, but this month is Mental Health Month, and it is something so very important to me. I know my father suffered tremendously. It's so unfortunate that even in the last final days of my father's life, and he was conscious, um, he was aware, and people asked if they wanted him, or if he wanted them to reach out to try to locate me, and it didn't happen. And when I when I discovered that he had passed away, um, it was is the weirdest feeling. And I know my father suffered a lot, and he put it out. He put his hurt and his pain and his trauma onto my siblings and I, and how we have suffered from it, and how I have seen, how some of this has been passed on to the next generation. But I know that, you know, I hope that you begin to consider forgiving your parents, forgiving those that may have caused trauma to you in your life, but especially in this case where I'm sharing about parents, my father, and maybe consider looking at what they went through as children and how that has impacted their life and the choices that they have made. And perhaps, hopefully, this you could find compassion and empathy in your heart so that whether your parent is still alive or not, you can, for so long I wanted answers. But I think in life there are times where we're not going to get answers to questions that we want, and to accept that and to take a step back and to look at something from a different angle rather than just focusing on you and how you were hurt and how you were impacted. So I want to leave you with that. It's can be overwhelming, but I know it's something that I deeply wanted to share. And so I hope that you will consider having that compassion and empathy and finding it within yourself to accept that you may not get answers to questions that you desperately want, and that's okay. And that you can love your parents for who they are and understand what the things that impacted their life and how it impacted their abilities to be parents, whether good or bad, but just how it happened for them. Well, didn't mean for that to happen, but I think I will go ahead and end there. So, thank you for watching. I'm Anthony from strongmancoaching.com. And as I like to say, stay strong.